The never-ending law enforcement dilemma lives on, you guys. A police officer uses what he deems the perfect, applicable, and appropriate use of force against the suspect, whereas the suspect's family and the entire community deem that exact same use of force excessive and inappropriate. How is this possible? Coral Springs, Florida, an incident happened. 14-year-old girl, mischief at the mall. The video went viral of her arrest. Basically, she comes out, the officers take her down, put her on her belly, and when they do, the officers are on top here, punching at the ribs, ripping away at the ribs, hoping to extract the arm, which they eventually do, and gain her compliance and, to take her into custody. But this is a serious situation.
Yeah, this is a case where the community obviously feels let down because it's two officers pinning her down, striking her, young girl, 14-year-old girl.
And all they're thinking is there has to be a better way to handle a 14-year-old girl. The mom of the suspect, of the girl in this situation, is at the leading of the campaign against the officers here, but the community is getting behind it saying, yo, isn't there a better way? Here's what we would have done in the exact same situation, and then we have a lot to talk about. On his belly right here, check this out. Suspect is down, man or woman, old or young, in shape, out of shape, makes no difference. We're coming up, assuming we know their hands are empty. We saw them go down without any weapons. Here's where we go. Shoulder hook, knee, hand, knee switch, walk to the north, private hand out, and then use compliance here, other hand coming out, and we're good to go, okay? No punches, no blood, no bruises. Hidden arm technique, this is what we teach in our G.S.T program, and it could have very well been applied in Coral Springs, Florida, but this is much bigger than that.
Yeah, this is all around the country, all around the world, okay? People want to trust, and they want to believe in the police department that serves their community. And G.S.T, we're here for you.
And you know what this boils down to? The gap between what the public perceives as acceptable use of force and what police departments perceive and are enacting as the acceptable uses of force. That gap is a community relations nightmare, and I think closing that gap has to be the top priority for every police department in the country, and we have some ideas on how to do that. But first, you have to understand the use of force continuums that guide the use of force in police departments around the country. This model right here is a very generic model. Each department has their own model for use of force. So we took a very standard, very generalized one to help the general public understand how this works with the interaction with the public. So you have the subject actions, right, in a situation, and then you have the officer's response to any given level of resistance or threat presented by the suspect in a situation. So first level of suspect or subject action is compliance, right? The lowest level, they're compliant, no problem, no harm, no foul. And in the same response, officer presence. Now, just to be clear, even within the use of force continuum, situations will differ based on the severity of the crime, the perceived and immediate threat level to the officer, the suspect's attempt to escape or evade a situation or avoid arrest. All those factors go into considering what level of force is appropriate, in addition to the simple kind of hierarchy and model that we're using here. Level 2, you have a resistant suspect, but they're passively resisting. And just to give a general idea, passive is, hey, go over there. No. Okay, so in that case, they just don't want to go. They're telling you no, right? So they're just not complying. They're not compliant. They're passively resisting. And in that case, contact controls are appropriate. So I would say, okay, we're going to walk this way, and you might escort the person that way, and you might walk them out. Simple contact controls, escort holds, and things of that nature. Nothing out of control. Then it moves into active resistance. And active resistance, whether it's standing or on the ground, is anything that the suspect does to physically and actively resist the arrest or the detainment of the officer trying to take them into custody, right? So if in this case in Coral Springs, that's what we were dealing with. The suspect was belly down. They weren't simply verbally saying, no, I'm not going to go. She was physically hiding her hands, keeping them out of reach of the officers in that particular situation. And active resistance warrants compliance techniques. Now, compliance techniques is a very broad term, right? Because that's where some of the discrepancy is and the confusion in each department and therefore in the communities that they serve. We're going to talk more about that in a second, but let's climb the ladder. Next is assaultive. So if I'm pushing Hito saying, come with me over here, and he starts punching me in the face, now I have an assaultive, not just a resistant subject, but an assaultive one. And then above that, you have assaultive with serious bodily harm or death as a possibility of their assault. We're talking with a weapon or a much larger suspect against a much smaller officer where one punch could potentially kill or knock out the officer and then someone could take the officer's gun. So when serious bodily harm or death are possible, that is the highest level of force. Oh, and from assaultive, you can use different defensive tactics. In some departments, we're talking about, taser, pepper spray, OC, other things. But what falls in this category and what falls in this category varies from department to department. But nonetheless, when you climb the ladder all the way up, lethal force, everyone knows what that is, right? So at the bottom, we have a compliant subject. At the top, we have someone trying to kill the officer or someone else. And at the bottom here, we have simple officer presence and verbal commands. And at the highest level here, you have lethal force. That's pretty universal, no matter what department. Where it starts to become, and even this is more universal, and even this is more universal. This middle section, where you have an actively resistant subject, right? Because if the girl was punching the officer in the face, there would be little debate that the officer could potentially use a strike to her body in response to the punch in the face to neutralize her aggression. So as you climb up here, it becomes less subjective in terms of what force is used by the officer to match the level of threat presented by the suspect.
Although I'm sure if she was punching the officers, they would still expect the officer not to assume that it's assault and not use defensive techniques and still maintain controls.
Right, especially being such a small,
especially being a woman
and that's where the specifics of the circumstance would come into play. We're talking about the size of the officer, the size of the girl, right? If you have a little 6-year-old kid who's kicking you in the shins, that could be considered assaultive, right? And you could use defensive punch in the face, but that would not necessarily be considered appropriate by the community. So just because something is authorized or acceptable use of force doesn't necessarily mean it's the appropriate use of force, especially when the framework of observation is the community's expectation of the police officers in the department that is supposed to be serving them, right? And that's where the challenge is, right? So we're not here to say what is right and what is wrong use of force. We're here to say the gap is the problem, and we got to close that gap. Yeah. So when we talk about actively resistant subjects and compliance techniques with the officers, this is what we end up with here, okay? The public perception. Here is the actual technique that the officers use in Coral Springs, and we're using that as an example, but it could have been any situation in the country, right? Where you have a suspect who is resisting arrest, actively resisting arrest, and you have the officers who used a very unnecessary, in their opinion, and by the way, in Coral Springs, they released a statement saying that the officers' techniques and use of force in that situation was 100% within department policy. So it's not even that the officer went out of policy. They were in policy, but therein lies the problem, because you can be within policy and actual use of force that you use is this. The expected use of force by the public. The public expects this and sees this, right?
And to be clear, the public expects this because they expect so much from law enforcement officials. They expect them to be so highly trained. We know the truth. We know that they're not so highly trained, and that for them to have knee on the suspect's back and punching them in the body, it makes perfect sense. I expect the officers to control, whether it's a 14-year-old or a 44-year-old, to hold them, and if they need to get the hands behind the back, I do expect them to use strikes.
Because you know
how little they know.
Yes.
And I feel like just in general, to punch somebody in the ribs, to pull their hands behind their back, is that too much? Yeah, I don't want my child being punched in the ribs to put the hand behind their back. I would not like that.
Right.
So it is too much in the situation of a child. But all of a sudden, if that was a 19-year-old,
right,
would it have been okay?
Right.
If it was a 24-year-old, I think it would have been less of an issue.
Right.
A 24-year-old man.
Less of an issue. If he had
much
violent crime, older guy, if he got up, it's a potential threat, someone could justify a little more.
You're just simply resisting. You're 25 years old and you're a man in your stomach. Nobody would have said a word. He's hiding his hands from the police. Because you're a child. Now, they don't have techniques for 12-year-olds and techniques for 44-year-olds. Right. They just have, if you hide your hands, and that's a problem. They have, if you resist, okay, if you're actively resisting, we do what we have to do, and that might mean strike.
Right, and here's the challenge, you guys, is that with the tools officers are currently being presented, the gap between what they're actually doing for this level 3 actively resisting, we're not talking even assaultive, we're only talking here and how this branches off. For the tools that officers are given, right, the actual use of force and the gap between that and what the public expects from a police officer is very big. It's called the acceptable force gap, AFG. The AFG score in each community determines how effective the relationship is. The public relations score and the AFG score are directly correlated, because if you have consistent incidences where the expected use of force, like we saw in Coral Springs, and what the officers actually did are that far apart based on limited tools provided to the officer, you're going to continue to have public relations nightmares, and ultimately the relationship between the public and the law enforcement community as a whole, nationwide, has never been as bad as it is right now. And it's going to continue to get worse if the acceptable force gap continues to spread.
Yeah.
Officers provided less training, the public expecting more. And why does the public expect more? Because there are more cameras. Everything is being filmed now, so they have enough incidences to see and have comparative analysis and say, wow, over there, that trained police officer did that. So over there, when he punches her in the ribs, that's not acceptable because I have an expectation of what should be done based on the amount of cameras that film every single incident under the sun. So it's not good enough to simply operate within your force continuum and get the job done anymore. You have to operate within the force continuum and get it done to the public's satisfaction, which means your department's AFG score, acceptable force gap, that acceptable force gap score can be 0 to 100. 0 meaning there's no gap. What you do and what the public perceives as acceptable are identical. Whereas 100 is what we saw over there. A 14-year-old girl getting punched by 2 officers.
Maybe like 80.
What? Oh yeah,
Like
there's
80.
yeah. So
It could
there's
have been much worse.
Listen, they could have been punching her in the face, right? They could have been slamming her head into the pavement.
They could have been hitting her with the...
Right, and here's the problem. Here's why this all happens, you guys. When officers are told, if have an actively resistant subject, use compliance techniques.
What does that mean? Compliance.
Thank you very much. And what this means is 100% contingent on the tools that officers are provided in their in-force training, tactics, schedules, and curriculums.
So I guess we need to close this gap, is
Yes.
what you're saying. And we need to close it by, the public understanding that the officers don't choose what they learn, how trained they are. It's not their decision. So expect a little less from the officer and maybe more from your department, that goes above the officer, the individual.
That brings this side up.
Yes. And you have to also understand that,
Right. So
well, and it kind of brings this side down.
no. I see, because
It brings this side down. So once you expect less, you understand that they have less tools. So then
That's a good
you
point.
look at what they're doing and you say, you know what? What else can they do? Now, people responded and shared with us comments saying there has to be other ways. There's better ways to do this. They don't even quite know what they're saying. They just know that it's out there.
Well, that's even the mom in the situation who's on the news right now saying this is totally unacceptable use of force.
Yes.
And here's the challenge. She can't even say what would be an acceptable use of force. She doesn't even know herself.
Well,
and it's important for her to know and for the law enforcement community to know that there is an answer, and your expectation that there be something different applied is understandable, justifiable, and there is a solution. And for law enforcement to know that compliance techniques can't all be summed up into one strategy to say, hey, if someone's hiding their hands, you punch them, because that won't always be appropriate depending on the nature of the crime and the suspect and the specifics of the suspect you're dealing with.
Yeah, I guess, in this video, there was a statement released and that we didn't know the whole story.
Right.
Which we can start from there. But in any situation similar to this, if someone is resistant and they're actively resisting, starting with the idea that, number one, is the officer's life in danger? Are they being harmed? If the officer is not being harmed, that's a good starting point as to where there's no major hurry to get this person handcuffed and taken away. So a little bit of time goes a long way, especially with a delicate situation like this, being a child. And so taking your time and just being there and controlling the child, the suspect, and then when the time permits, handcuffing them. So starting there, I think, would already take some pressure off the officer, where quite often the officer feels like there's this urgency to quickly handcuff the suspect, and in this case, it backfired.
And so that's a great point. And you started talking about how do we close the gap? From the community side, you close the gap with 2 ways. Number one is you understand the limitations law enforcement have to have enough officers patrolling the streets, and with the limited budget, limited time they have, and the amount of people they need to have out in the streets, not in a gym training, because then no one's patrolling the streets, all of those factors and case study and case law, right? So previous precedent set by other situations affect the amount of training and the type of training officers receive. So there needs to be a greater understanding from the public. The second thing the public can do is cooperate. Cooperate.
So you're saying that, for example, if you're guilty, right? If you did do something, if you were causing a disturbance,
you got caught, cooperate.
if you're causing disturbance, cooperate. But what if you're innocent? What if you didn't do what the officer says you did? They show up in the scene, they start to get on your case, and it wasn't you didn't do anything.
I'll tell you what they normally do. So normally, you're compliant until an officer tells you that you committed a crime you didn't commit. Let's say you truly are innocent. You're compliant. The second they tell you committed the crime, you quickly become resistant, right? And you start saying, no, I didn't do that. And then if they say, yes, you did, I'm going to have to control you. Then you become actively resistant, and it's not too uncommon that people then become assaultive when they're committed of a crime, or being accused, I should say, accused of a crime that they did not commit.
Yeah,
to point out what you're saying is you went from, so the question is what to do.
Yeah, you're fighting because you know that you are innocent. And you're fighting for you're being wrongly accused. And it makes sense that you're fighting. But you have to understand that it's not the officer can't do all of this investigating in that spot. There could be multiple people on the scene. They don't have time to have 20-minute conversation with every person that's there.
They don't know all the facts yet.
To figure out who did what and who's innocent and who's not. So sometimes that might mean that they handcuff and arrest a few people that are innocent.
And then investigate everything.
Yes, and then they'll talk to you. And if you're truly innocent, me, for example, I might get in a situation where I'm handcuffed. No problem. I'm going to sit in the patrol car. I'm going to go wherever they take me. And then I'm going to talk and I'm going to explain my story. I'm going to have no problem explaining with very clear detail, very simply.
Why is that? Because you understand what you just said, Hidon, that the officer doesn't know everything.
Now, the thing is
so you understand their side of the thing.
We can understand today that people might feel like they are being singled out, right? Like you're kind of picking on the person. So that causes a little bit of an extra natural, emotion and resistance to the situation. But listen, the job of a police officer is so difficult. Everybody is against them. There's so much negativity. They feel like everybody's has it out for them.
Right.
And now the guilty person who commits the crime is also feel like everybody has it out for them. Everyone's trying to get them. The innocent are mixed up in the middle of all of this. Right? So the innocent have to understand that they're dealing with people that are crazy and that are guilty, and they themselves
that the cops are dealing with the people that are crazy,
yes,
and the innocent.
The cops are.
They deal with both.
Correct. And just in general, they have this very, stressful, very negative outlook on things. Everybody's bad. So because of that, if a police officer comes around me, I'm right away, hey, how can I help you? You can handcuff me, you can arrest me, no problem. We'll talk about this later. Okay, I want to make you, the police officer, feel comfortable.
Right.
And I want you to know that I'm on your team. Now, if the person...
Imagine if you go and become assaulted because you're wrongfully accused.
No, now I'm guilty of assault.
Now you're guilty of assault.
You don't get a free pass. I mean, they're not going to clear your assault on the officer because you were innocent to what they thought, they stopped you for.
Yes.
No, you assaulted a police officer and you don't want to do that.
There you go, you guys. So from the public's perspective, understanding the limitations on police training, it's just the reality. You cannot agree with it, but you have to at least know that it's the case. Don't think they're all trained Navy SEALs, patrolling your streets. It's different and it's difficult, and we know this firsthand. And cooperate. Whether you're innocent or guilty, cooperate so that you don't go from a compliant, innocent person to an assaulted, now guilty because of you've assaulted an officer. Okay? Avoid that jump. That's from the public's perspective. From the law enforcement department side of things, you have to understand, number one, that not all compliance techniques are created equally. There should be, within level 3 actively resistant suspect, there should be a variation, there should be a range of force options that allow you to arrest someone in a situation like this without any punches whatsoever, but that requires training and pursuing the most progressive tactics for law enforcement, right? That's one. The other thing is that law enforcement has to understand that it's not good enough simply to carry out the job. They must do so with consideration for how it's perceived in the public's eye and how it's filmed on camera. Now, not to the expense that you put yourself at risk. We understand your safety is the number one priority and you guys have incredibly difficult jobs. However, you do serve your communities, and maintaining a positive community relationship should be at the top priority along with going home safe at the end of the day. It's very important, you guys, because having that positive community relationship is only going to increase I wouldn't say the ease, because there's never ease, but make your job a lot easier because there's trust reestablished with police departments in the communities they serve.
That trust that can be established between the officer, the department, and the community is going to help, especially in these situations.
Right.
Where the officer maybe wrongly accuses somebody of something. It's going to help where the suspect will have the person will have an easier time cooperating.
Yes.
Because they know that this department is on their side.
Yes.
Where if things happen
if you get more of these,
where there's too much of a gap and the officer is using, strikes to the head, strikes to the rib, and excessive force, then it's like, man, if I comply, if I go with you, people don't understand what happens when handcuffs get put on.
Right.
People might be thinking that when they get handcuffs put on, they get taken away, they're going to get beat up in the car or in a jail. They're going to be thrown in the prison cell 22 minutes later. They have no idea what the process is from being handcuffed. So they're going to fight for their lives to avoid this happening.
Because of the distrust.
Because it's happened.
Now, he don't say excessive force, but we'll be clear. Excessive in the perception of the public, right? Because we already agree that this strikes in the ribs is 100% within policy in Coral Springs and at many departments around the country, and we understand that. However, just because something is an appropriate level of force doesn't mean it's acceptable level of force to the public, and there should be some consideration for where that happy medium is and how we can close the gap. Maybe we don't close it all the way, because the truth is the public will never fully understand the challenges that face law enforcement, and law enforcement will never fully understand the perception, the framework that the public observes their work in. So it's hard, right? But we have to try and know that closing that gap is the only hope we have to once again reestablish a positive relationship between communities and law enforcement that has been lost for the last several decades, and that losing of that relationship has coincided with the visibility of the incidences of arrest between officers and suspects, because people are seeing more and more that these officers are using force that they don't agree with. So let's try to close the gap, you guys. Training, consideration, understanding, empathy for either side of the situation. I think there's a lot can be done here.
And it's being done, right? As we're seeing all around the country, police departments from all around are contacting us and they're learning G.S.T. The program is growing, so it's been great. So on this side of law enforcement, it is happening. So for all the communities out there, all the civilians, know that every day, every year, there are more and more police officers on the path to learn more options within this.
And yeah, great point. And I'll end this video with the summary that we always give and we think requires and totally warrants reinforcement, and that you cannot generalize law enforcement. You can't say cops and speak about them in the generic cops of America term, because that doesn't exist. Now, even though they exist in spirit, right? When you're law enforcement, your team law enforcement, fine. But from a practical execution and working implementation of tactics perspective, there is no generic term for cops. What there is department by department. And when we talk about the challenges facing one department, we can name 100 other departments, federal, state, and local, where this gap is already being squeezed because of the advancements made in training and understanding made by the community and the reinforced trust that has come from that closing of the gap. Do not generalize law enforcement, right? A police officer in Bellevue, Washington might be progressing and focusing on their training so they can be as gentle as they can when dealing with teenagers in a mall, where in Nebraska or somewhere else, they have no consideration whatsoever for those same tactics. So please, keep them separate, and I think that it's a much more achievable goal if we see departments as individual entities than if we look at this as a nation's problem, that every department is screwed, all communities are screwed. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's fair, and I think that wrong assumption and kind of grouping of law enforcement is at the core of a lot of the dissension throughout the country and a lot of the negative opinions about law enforcement, because they're being grouped, and that's wrong. We know it, they know it.
Yeah, they're all feeding off of each other. Because it is happening all across the country, but it's also not happening all across the country.
Yes, it's happening everywhere, but it's not happening in every department, right? So steps are being taken. We appreciate you guys listening. This is very much of a law enforcement talk, but how better to close the gap than to understand what makes law enforcement departments function and the limited training that they receive, right? So for the public, we think this is very important talk, to share this. And remember, you guys, cooperate. The best thing you can do as the general public is cooperate and work with law enforcement, and don't turn a compliant, smooth functioning situation or a preemptive arrest to make sure that the situation is clear, and a safety arrest that they might often make. Don't turn that into an assaultive situation and then be guilty of a crime that you could have avoided altogether.
Do everything you can not to assault.
Right. Do everything you can to live in this category for the rest of your life. All right? And we'll end on that. Thank you, guys. Hey, guys, one more thing. If anyone knows these two police officers, please have them reach out to us. I want to sponsor these two and their defensive tactics coordinator to attend the G.S.T 5-day instructor certification course that we have going on in Orlando, Florida, December 17 through 21. It's right there in their neck of the woods. And we absolutely believe that by learning and implementing the G.S.T techniques, they're going to lower their AFG score and help bridge the gap between, the department use of force policy and the community expectations. A critical mission for every police department in the country. If you know them, have them reach out. The rest of you guys, check out our 2019 G.S.T schedule and make sure you get to one of the courses. We'll see you on the mat.